Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of the 2026 VVBGA Winter Webinar Series. I'm Laura Johnson. I work on the Veg and Berry team in pollinator support. And today our presentations are about promoting pollinator health on vegetable farms. And we are joined by Chuck Wooster from Sunrise Farm and Ryan Fitzbeauchamp at Evening Song Farm. So I am going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to first hear from Chuck, and then we'll have some questions if there are any, and then hear from Ryan. And again, we'll have time for questions after that. And we have to also thank our funders, the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Market, and the Transition to Organic Partnership Program for partnering with the VBGA and Extension to host these webinars. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then Chuck, if you want to, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Laura and Andy and everybody for putting this together. My name is Chuck Wooster. I'm at Sunrise Farm, and we are just a few miles south of White River Junction on Route 5, so a relatively prominent spot. We've got about 7 acres of vegetables and about 40 acres of grass and a few hundred acres of woodland, so kind of a diversified farm. Our main business is an on-farm pickup CSA with about 425 members. We also grow our own chickens for meat, chickens for eggs, and lamb. And increasingly with our spot here on Route 5, we're getting more into sort of the retail farm stand business because we do have a fair bit of traffic on the road. This is a aerial view that one of our members took from a drone and sent our way. This is our main site. You can kind of get a little sense for what we're up to. The big red barn is the CSA pickup area. We've got some crew housing there, some heated propagation houses right next to the barn, some unheated tunnels here. We have a bunch of other unheated tunnels in a different location. And then the white building is an animal barn where the chickens and the sheep are managed. We have spent a fair bit of time thinking about pollinators and happy to share what we do. And a lot of it is pretty straightforward. And I don't think anyone's going to hear anything earth-shattering, but I think my main message would be that kind of thinking about them and taking some basic steps can really yield great results. It's always hard to say on a vegetable farm. In our case, we're a certified organic farm. It's always hard to know, what the pollinators are doing for you. And so we have great faith that they're doing a ton for us and that the steps that we're taking are good. And we generally seem to have great pollination in our crops that are insect pollinated. So that's great. But it's always a little hard to know exactly what the benefits are other than it really seems to be it's working on our end. So, okay, so the first set of things I want to talk about is everyone probably has a mower of some kind for managing your headlands. And so one of the easiest things to do is kind of be thoughtful about your mowing. And in particular, sort of be seasonal in your mowing. So in this particular picture here, we're flailing a field behind some sheep grazing, but you can see along the middle of the photo there, this is kind of a mid-September photo. There's a bunch of Joe Pye weed and goldenrod and a bunch of things that are growing along this low area. And so what we do is around our vegetable fields and around the pasture, we always try to leave a decent margin, which might be, 1 or 2 or even 3 kind of bush hog strips, and let that grow the entire year. And so you have this great reservoir of pollinators that are therefore sort of surrounding your crop, your vegetable areas at all times. This is a fun one because the next time I came around, you can see there's a little red fox right there who just came zipping out onto the field to work on the rodent issue, which is great. So not a pollinator, but good for wildlife. This is another picture here of our farm. That's Route 5 right there, some town ball fields across the way. You can see a ton of asters and things that we're letting grow along this upper side of the field. This is probably a June shot. That little tan streak in the middle of the photo is the top of my dog, who's a big full-size dog. So you can see some real kind of lush growth here along the upper side of this pasture. So again, it kind of comes back to sort of mowing. It's nothing too more complicated than that. In this case here, I wanted to show this slide. In the very bottom of the photo, you can see some of our croplands and irrigation gun. And then behind that, that sort of light brown, that is the area that we let grow all summer. This is probably an early October picture. And so we've just gone and mowed down that area right along that lower brook there. One thing I have discovered is if you go this approach of sort of letting something kind of grow all year, it's really hard to mow it in August and September because it's really rank and thick. And so generally, if we're going to mow things early, we try to do it in June. Otherwise, we try to go, as far as we can into October, something like that. But you can see right along that whole strip of vegetable crops, we had a great kind of stand of wild pollinators that's just been mowed. We integrate animals into our kind of pollinator plan, but you don't need to have animals to do a bunch of these things. You can use your mowing around your vegetable areas to sort of encourage plants of multiple ages. That seems to be the key. So in this case, the sheep are coming in here. There's a bunch of kind of buttercups and things you can see. Behind them, we also have our pastured chickens here. You can see in the foreground, there's a bunch of white clover and red clover, which are fantastic for pollinators. The white clover in particular can be great for honeybees over the course of a summer because they will feast on them all year. And if you have a steady supply of white clover, then you'll always have the honeybees around. So again, in this case, we're integrating animals into this, but you could also establish this by having areas that you mow shorter. So you can sort of think of kind of a mosaic in your mind that you're going to have some areas that you're going to mow only once a year, and you might have areas that you mow, twice a year, 3 times a year, just to kind of give you a wide variety of ages and flowering. So, but in this case, the white clover seems to be a really great addition to our pollinator habitat. We have had some honeybees in the past. It became something that I found was hard for us to manage. And it turns out there's other people that have honeybees in our neighborhood, which is great. And honeybees can travel, 2-3 miles if they need to. So now that we don't have our hives, we still are seeing honeybees all over the place. So we're getting some good pollination from the neighbors that way. Also in this photo, you can see in the center there below those white pines is sort of a tree island. This picture is taken, it looks like in kind of late April maybe. You can see that brown ring around the tree island. And that again, that's the area that we let grow all year and that we mowed in November. So it's still brown right now. It hasn't greened back up, but you can see that tree island is right adjacent to the cropland and the hoop houses that are right next to it. So we're getting that benefit. Another thing that many of you probably already do, but if you haven't, you can of course plant perennials. We have a variety of perennials that are included in our operation. Blueberries that we pick some of, and some of them are pick your own. We also have a bunch of tree fruit, which is great. So you really get some great pollination early in the year, attract pollinators to your site. This is a short season. Obviously, these are flowering in May, right next to the rhubarb there. But it's nice if you can sort of conceptually in your mind, you'd love to have things for your pollinators to eat over the course of the entire year. So spring, before some of our vegetable plants are really getting going, having some of these perennials is a great addition. I'm sure vegetable growers, everyone's familiar with cover cropping. We do a lot of cover cropping. We love buckwheat because it's so fantastic for pollinators. Again, the honeybees love this, but all kinds of flies and insects are in here. In fact, the hard thing can be, you don't want it to go to seed accidentally, so you have to get in there when it's, kind of at full flower. I usually try to mow it first thing in the morning because if you go in the afternoon, it just feels like you're committing ecocide as you take the mower through this stuff. But then gets us a testament to to how great of a cover crop buckwheat is, because you get that quick biomass, but you're getting tremendous pollination as part of it. This is another shot, kind of again showing some cover cropping. This is oats and peas, so that's less desirable for the pollination approach, but it gives you a sense of we try to have a bunch of things going on at the same time. So this is probably again early October, so we've got some rye coming into on the left there, so it's a little bit late, but I wanted to show this just to kind of give a sense of kind of a mosaic of what's going on. This similarly here, we had a crop in here. We had some tarps on. The bare ground in front of you has just been seeded, probably to oats and peas. But we've got these two beds of buckwheat still rolling right next to it. So those are just kind of coming into full flower here. So trying to sort of conceptually, it'd be great if we always had a little bit of buckwheat going somewhere for the pollinators to move around from. So to some extent, as you're planning your crop rotations, thinking about your cover crop, just kind of, again, having that conceptual idea in mind of, is there going to be something for them to eat at any particular moment? This, again, shows a little bit of that mosaic and succession going on. So the really light green in the middle there is a stand of buckwheat that's coming along. Then we have some bare ground to the right of that. And we have been working with NRCS to get a little bit of funding to improve our pollinator game. So this bare ground here got planted to canola, which led to this really gorgeous stand of flowers that we had kind of September into November. A really amazing kind of late season opportunity for pollinators. We started working with NRCS on this as part of a EQIP grant for high tunnels. So we're going to put up some more high tunnels with NRCS assistance. And part of that, they really encouraged us to think about pollination as well. And so there's a little bit of money that's part of our contract, which is great for planting canola. This summer, we're actually going to have a succession of sunflowers at both of our sites, which will be a fun addition to our cover crop rotation that we probably wouldn't have done otherwise. And so really NRCS has gotten me to think a little bit more broadly, sort of get past buckwheat and some of the standards and include some things that have that great pollination benefit too. Also in this photograph, so you can see there's the bare ground that's coming into canola. To the right of that, you can see this sort of a pasture area that we have mowed once already this summer. And so you can see there's a bunch of Queen Anne's lace, which a lot of flies and insects love, kind of next to the fruit trees. And then way over to the right, outside the deer fence, you can see a huge stand of goldenrod, an area that we don't mow but once a year. So you kind of, again, get that mosaic from the pollinator perspective here. You can see a bunch of different things going on with a bunch of different crops. So it's, again, not like, none of this is earth shattering. Except for I always try to have this in mind when I'm thinking about things, and hence I think we have a broader array of pollinators for a longer period of time than we might otherwise. This has been a fun project that I think may well benefit all of us at some point here. There's a nonprofit here in White River called the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and they have been doing they have some trial plots kind of all around the Upper Valley, including one right on our farm, where they are planting a bunch of native flowers to try to see what kind of pollinators are attracted to different ones, with the idea being that they can then make recommendations to all of us of things that we might plant for pollinators in particular. So we have this beautiful demonstration garden right on the farm, right where the CSA members can wander over and kind of see what's taking place. One thing I should mention here is milkweed, which you can see is one of the natives on their sign here. And as part of my mowing too, it's a little bit hard because milkweed can be so quickly invasive in pastures. And so I don't love to let a lot of it go. But as part of that kind of areas that we mow only once a year, we do try to encourage milkweed in those areas because it's a great native pollinator that a lot of different insects and of course the monarchs love. So But this has been fun too, and I hope that this is, I think, a 3-year study. This will be the second year, and it'll be fun to see what comes out of this. To see are there things that we could be planting around our cropped areas. And then the final thing that we do is we grow a lot of flowers for our CSA members, which is pretty much all pick your own. But you can see here this close up of the sunflower. We've got a bumblebee on there, a couple of flies are on there. So the flowers can be really wonderful. I have no idea, the range of the pollinators that are being attracted to these. Other than that, when you go out into the flower areas, they're just insects all over the place, especially as the season progresses. And so, thinking about having flowers in succession, which of course is wonderful for the CSA members, but it also means you've got a wide variety available for the pollinators. So this is an example of some pick your own flowers right outside our CSA barn, kind of in the foreground. If you look in the back left there, you can see that sign from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. So that little patch back there on the left, you can see there's a bunch of those native plants there that are flowering as part of their project. And then the final thing about flowers, of course, is that people pick them and love them, and you have future CSA members right there looking on. So that's a very kind of quick overview. As I said, probably little to nothing about this is going to be earth-shattering to vegetable growers. And other than, I think, that idea of if you sort of put pollinators into your ongoing brain space, you'll often find that there are relatively easy ways to adjust your cover crop plan or your mowing or what you're growing, and you'll get great benefits with very little benefit. So that would be my kind of take-home message there. So yeah, that's what I have, Laura.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me just see if there's any questions. I don't see any questions in the chat. I have a question about your cover crops. And how are you seeding them or establishing them? Are you using a drill or broadcast or?
Yes, great question. We have our growing beds, as you can sort of see from those photos, are relatively kind of small in area and dispersed. So a lot of our cover cropping, we will just broadcast, and then we'll take like a Williams tine rake over it to get some soil contact. For the small seeds, because we don't have a drill, we'll often even just drive the tractor back and forth to sort of get kind of wheel coverage to pack down. So pretty much all broadcasting. We do have a chest-mounted broadcaster. We also have a big cone we can put on the tractor. So if we're going to do, a quarter of an acre, half an acre, then it's lovely to put it on the tractor. But sometimes, as you can see from those 2 beds of buckwheat that were kind of interplanted there, it's super easy just to put the chest spreader on and go and just do a couple of beds like that. Maybe one other thing I'll add is that we have borrowed the Regional Conservation District. They have a couple of drills, and so we have borrowed the drills from them to drill clover and legume into our pastures, which of course is great for the animals, but it really helps when you are doing some kind of a regular mowing. You can keep that clover flowering the whole time. So often the rental from your conservation district is free. You need to kind of coordinate with them and arrange for how it's going to get to your place. But if you don't have a seed drill of your own, or if you're trying to drill into an existing sod, that's a great option that we've used and will use again this year.
Great. Thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks, Chuck. That was neat to see. And similarly, my presentation will echo many of the same themes with some slightly different approaches. I think one of the differences between our farm and yours, Chuck, is our production is a little bit smaller. We grow 4 acres of vegetables and cover crops, and so we have a more limited land base. And so our approach to pollinator management has kind of taken that slightly different approach. And I think that's one of the interesting things about it, as like you were saying, Chuck, is that the concepts are pretty simple, but the variety of approaches that a farm can take to implement those concepts are so diverse. And so I think it's a neat thing for us to be talking about as growers, what that looks like on all of our farms. Um, so so why do we manage pollinators on our farm? I think for a while in the early years of our farm production, I gave it very little thought and just assumed that, there's enough wild spaces around the edges of our farm that I didn't need to focus on that. And I think also in the earlier years of our farm, there was more pressing management concerns. So I didn't give it very much attention until about 3 years ago. My family took a vacation in the summer to Scarborough, Maine, and visited Frith Farm. And that was an inspiring visit for me to see a piece of land that was so well managed, and in particular to see the amount of annual and perennial flowers that were in bloom at their farm, and just how many pollinators were visiting those flowers. I just had never seen bumblebees like that in those numbers. And then also seeing how relatively free of insect pest pressure many of the crops there were. That kind of flipped a switch for me and got me to start to think about what we could do on our farm. And so, as I was thinking about this presentation, I thought that there was kind of three main approaches to maintaining abundant pollinator populations. And so the first would be increasing the amount and diversity of pollen and nectar available to pollinators early spring through late fall, and like Chuck was saying, distributed throughout your farm. And that's mostly what I'm going to be focusing on today. That's actually entirely what I'm going to talk about. But I wanted to mention these other two because they're important to consider. Increasing habitat or cover for nesting and overwintering. So that's just maintaining sites not necessarily to produce pollen, but more having brushy edges and hollow stems, rotting logs, limiting tillage and mowing in some spaces so that pollinators have spaces to nest and spaces to overwinter. And that's mostly going to be not in your production fields, of course, but areas around them. Um, and then finally, reducing pesticide exposure to pollinators is obviously important, but not something that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So focusing on increasing the nectar. There's so many different species of pollinators and different predatory and predatory insects and parasitic insects and all of these different amazing species that I know very little about. And so it would be neat to manage at that level of particular flowers at particular times for the predatory species that you want to grow, but that's beyond my ability for now. So I just try to have as many blooms as possible distributed around our farm for as long as possible during the season, and figure that's a pretty good stand-in. Um, so as far as increasing the amount of nectar and pollen available, our farm kind of has that in three different buckets. The first is looking at cover crop blooms for pollen and nectar sources. The second is growing annual flowers alongside long season vegetable crops. And the third is managing grassy, brushy, and forested areas around our crop fields, specifically for the pollen and nectar production in those areas. So the first one, cover crops. Um, I'm going to go through the season, beginning in the early season for what cover crops we've grown that provide blooms for pollinators. So in the early spring, one that is not technically a cover crop, but kind of functions like one in our high tunnels is allowing our overwintering kale to flower. We only did this 1 year, and it was really neat how much just green, juicy biomass was grown by those kale flowering plants, and how many blooms there were in there. And it was kind of a neat way to turn a cash crop into a cover crop in only a few weeks. Um, and there was just so many bumblebees that came in to work those flowers. It was really neat. But the downside for us is that our high tunnel space is limited and very valuable to us. And so even though it was kind of a really quick cover crop, really, by the time the cash crop was not harvestable, it was maybe 3 or 4 weeks to get a nice cover crop out of it. Those 3 to 4 weeks tend to be too valuable for us in our high tunnel, so we haven't continued doing that. But it's kind of a neat option to think about if that could be something that fits into your high tunnel rotation. So then the next blooming cover crop we have is in late May to early June, crimson clover and rye. So we seed when we try to do this, we'll seed rye at a low seeding rate and crimson clover at a high seeding rate. And we'll seed that in mid-November or so, broadcast and lightly worked into the soil. And the crimson clover, if it has some moisture, will really grow and fill in the space pretty well, in spite of a low seeding rate of rye. So there's really excellent coverage going into the winter. So for us on our farm, crimson clover, we're like zone 4B. It's the literature says that it's a marginal cover crop for overwintering, but for the last 4 years, crimson clover has overwintered every single year. We've had good snow cover all those years. And if we add, sometimes we add vetch to crimson clover, and that makes it nice. And if we were to have a year of low snow cover with winter kill, the vetch would fill in the space nicely and provide a legume and maybe even some flowers. Pollinators like the crimson clover, and you'll see them working the flowers. And it's probably a 1 to 2 week pollination window if you don't want the rye and crimson clover to go to seed. Um, However, it is an interesting thing to think about as vegetable growers if we can have our cover crops go to seed, and if they can be part of a rotation where rye and crimson clover grow seed in that area, perhaps to grow another cover crop in that space. So I think it's always interesting to think about that in our rotations to see if there are opportunities to allow cover crops to go to seed to extend the bloom time and provide other benefits for the farm. So here's a field of rye and crimson clover right just before termination. And then the next blooms that come in are yellow blossom sweet clover, and those will come in late June. Um, the yellow blossom sweet clover has been a really awesome cover crop on our farm. It's been a little tricky to get it just right so that the weed management is excellent. We establish it in August with oats, and it overwinters and comes in the next year. Flowers the following June. But it's just such an amazing fertility producer, uh, limited by the fact that it matures in late June, and so there's limited options to grow a cash crop after that. But here's yellow sweet clover on the left and rye on the right in probably mid-late May. There's the sweet clover blooming a few weeks later in around June 15th, June 20th for us. And so there's just incredibly abundant blooms on this plant. It's very similar to buckwheat in how much the pollinators love these flowers, and it's really an amazing pollinator plant in addition to the benefits that it does for uh, preceding a cash crop in its nitrogen production. Um, The one thing I don't know how long it takes sweet clover to grow seed. I haven't grown it out to seed. I've terminated it at full bloom, and so maybe it can go a little longer. But again, it's also it's not a very aggressive plant when the seeds germinate, and so depending on what follows yellow sweet clover in a rotation, it may be possible to grow seed of it and have that worked into a rotation where it isn't problematic. So next up is buckwheat. As Chuck said, such an excellent pollinator, and I'm sure many of us have walked into a field of buckwheat and just heard how many insects are utilizing those flowers. Um, the thing, as you know, Chuck mentioned this too, it will go to seed very quickly, and so we'll let the flowers be on there for about a week. And in most of the rotations that we have on our farm, I don't want to have a lot of buckwheat seed in that on that field. It would be problematic for me. But I'm curious at exploring rotations where we can grow buckwheat, allow it to flower longer, and where the seed production wouldn't be a problem. And I think one of the ways we're going to try that this year is utilizing buckwheat in a fallow field where we'll do some fallow tillage until early June, seed buckwheat in early June, allow that to flower and go to seed. And then that area will be seeded to a small grain and medium red clover in the fall to grow a clover sod in that field to grow the fertility of that field for a year or so before bringing it back into vegetable production. And I think with seed like buckwheat that's so big and starchy, I think that having it inside for a year will probably I don't expect to have a whole lot of buckwheat seed when I rotate it back into vegetables. And we may even start with we may not start with a small direct seeded crop in case there is some buckwheat seed in there. But the point is just to think about as we're growing cover crops, is there an opportunity to allow it to grow seed in the context of a particular rotation? And then, so another thing that Laura has done a good job at outreach with growers is the possibility of staggering buckwheat plantings to have overlapping bloom periods. So by the time we mow one field of buckwheat, there's another field that is starting to bloom. So all of those pollinators have someplace else to go that's right there. So with cover crops, I think there's lots of competing management factors. And as I share all of this information about prioritizing pollinators and cover crops, I also wanted to share that it's providing floral resources through cover crops is generally, I consider that to usually be one of the lower goals in thinking about cover crop management. And so there's effective cash crop production. I think that like the main reason I grow cover crops is to make it easier um, to grow cash crops. And so if growing cover crops makes it more difficult to grow cash crops, then I wouldn't, I would try not to, make that management decision. Similar with weed seed bank management, that's something that is important to us on our farm and would not prioritize growing pollen and nectar over managing a weed seed bank well. And also the biomass production from cover crops and the nitrogen fixation that we get from cover crops are other important goals for us that generally take higher priority over pollinator management. But but I think what's neat is that I find there's a lot, even with prioritizing these goals in cover crop management, there's still a lot of flexibility to then look at how you can maximize the blooms from your cover crops. And so the last thing in here was an idea that Laura sparked of just seeing if there are different cover crops that can be grown in rotation so that a farm, has blooming cover crops for more of the season, ideally from early spring through late fall, but in practicality for as many of those times as possible. And so this is what we have right now with some gaps in between. And so these are just some ideas that I've had for my farm. Before late May, I'm curious about frost seeding mustard. I put a question mark because I don't know if that would bloom any earlier than rye and crimson clover, but you're hearing from Lakeview Organic Grain. They've been doing a lot of mustard frost seeding, and in their climate, it matures in mid-May. So it's something to consider, but also a risk on our farm where we grow a lot of brassicas of perhaps being a concern for flea beetles. I'm curious if anybody's had that experience with mustard, cover crop, and flea beetles. And then in the gap between rye and crimson clover and the yellow blossom sweet clover, if we had a field in a cover crop of Dutch white clover, I think that could fill that gap pretty nicely by having a lot of white clover flowers bloom at the end of the rye and into the yellow blossom sweet clover bloom. And then after the yellow sweet clover, there's a few possibilities. I think if we had a field of medium red clover, I would expect those blooms to overlap with the yellow sweet clover and continue afterwards. Another spring-seeded cover crop possibility for that is oats and peas and phacelia. Our farm has grown that before in the spring. At that time, we didn't have a great rotation for it or a great crop to follow after it. So I felt like I wasn't really able to make the most of that cover crop. And then the last one is berseem clover, which I haven't grown, but I understand is a good clover for seeding early in the spring, putting on a lot of quick growth and flowering early and getting some good soil coverage and nitrogen production by mid-July or so. So mid-July through September, there's the buckwheat successions for at least some of that time. And I'm curious, kind of like Chuck was saying, I'm curious if I can work sunflowers into a cover crop mix to be able to have a lot of sunflower blooms in a field that's otherwise being cover cropped during the summer. I haven't figured out what that mix is yet because something like sorghum Sudan grass I would want to mow, and the sunflowers wouldn't tolerate that mowing, but it's kind of something that I'm thinking about for a summer cover crop. So that's everything for cover crops. The next bucket I have is growing annual flowers alongside vegetable crops. This is really quite simple and easy and fun, and we just did it for the first time this past year, and I really recommend it if it can fit in your farm operation. Um, but what we grow some transplants that are ready to plant out in June through July. We'll plant them at the ends of long season vegetable crops like the Solanaceous and Brassica families, leeks and parsnips. And so that includes sunflowers. We'll put in plugs of sunflowers and also put seeds right alongside them so that there's a little extended bloom on those sunflower plants. Alyssum, marigolds, zinnias, cosmos, cilantro, dill, purple top verbena. There's many others, of course, that you could grow for this. And then we'll plant them out randomly in the ends of these beds before we're expecting some rain. It takes very little effort to do it, and I think it was a real morale booster for our farm as these plants grew and flowered, and it just felt really good to be working in a space with all of these beautiful flowers at the ends of all of our fields. So this is what it looked like as planting a field of leeks and dry beans and celery with the little seedlings that tucked in at the ends of the beds. And then 8 weeks later or so, as that field matured, it was just these wonderful, wonderful flowers that make our farm feel a little extra nice late in the summer. Another way to use annual flowers is to fill in gaps in long season crops. So this is a field of parsnips where we lost a little bit of our stand to some perhaps carrot weevil. I'm not sure, but these little seedlings just got nibbled down by an insect. Um, and we had some gaps in the rows, and we filled them in with cosmos and dill and cilantro. And it was just really, it didn't take anything away from the parsnips. There was a lot of insects in that on those blossoms, and it felt good to have this field of parsnips be a little more wild and beautiful. Another one that we tried this last year was seeding alyssum alongside widely spaced transplants like Brussels sprouts, peppers, and eggplants. Here's a row here in between rows of peppers. This is probably mid-late July that the alyssum's flowering. And it just blooms for so long. It starts in July and it just like keeps growing new flowers, and there's always insects on them. And it's really neat in that way. Whereas many other of these flowering plants have such a short bloom window, it's kind of neat to have one to plant alyssum and just have it keep blooming. Lots of pollinator activity. I think the downside or the constraint to this is that um, you also are growing a lot of alyssum seed in this part of your farm. And so I'm in this rotation with this field has been the pepper stubble has been flail mowed and the field has been mulched with straw. And we're going to grow some transplanted crops like kale and chard in single rows on top of these ridges. So I think it'll be easy enough to prevent the alyssum from being too competitive with that crop, but it's certainly a consideration in your planning. And so the final bucket that I'm going to talk about is management of areas adjacent to production fields, and um, specifically in terms of maximizing or increasing the pollen and nectar that these areas produce. So this is a hedgerow in our field on a stone wall that has been there for many generations. And there's some trees that are growing there. Many of those trees, like red maple and serviceberry and mountain maple, that produce a lot of flowers. And so I'm just conscious of those as I manage this hedgerow for, um, light on our field and, um, you know, harvesting firewood or whatever it may be. It's just an awareness that I have that some of these trees are better pollen and nectar producers than others, especially at red maples, for example, at a very early time in the season. Um, and then in the foreground, there's lots of willows, male and female willows that produce nectar and pollen. There's goldenrod. In this area, there's golden alexanders that bloom very early in the spring and spirea that blooms in August. So there's a lot that's going on here that I don't have to do very much to, but it has also been a change in perspective for me to just kind of acknowledge that that's there. And then if I am going to be doing anything in there, I can make more mindful decisions about my management of plants in those areas. There's some willow flowers and flowers on mountain maple. And and then the last thing that I kind of tried doing in this area in these areas was I got a little excited a few years ago about starting and growing some native perennial plants that in particular species that we don't have a lot of around us. And so I ordered some seeds and grew them in our greenhouse of many different species and then kind of kept them in little pots for the rest of the year, just watered them when we watered everything else, and they overwintered outside. And then the next spring, I went through, where that arrow is pointing, where there's some goldenrod. Um, I just took the tractor bucket and just scooped up a few inches of soil in those areas, added that soil to one of our compost piles, um, and then planted the many of those plugs in that scraped off area and put some mulch around it. And I think one of the, at least what I understand about many of those native pollinator plants is that they're well adapted to surviving in this and self-propagating in these ecosystems, and so don't need a lot of the tender care that we're used to giving many of our vegetable crops. Um, so at any rate, I planted a lot of different species in some of these areas. Of course, taking out some goldenrod to do that, but maybe introducing some more diversity of blooms throughout the season. So I can't say whether or not I like the results of that yet because it's been too soon, but it was an interesting thing to try. And then the last thing is mowing, and this will echo what Chuck shared, only perhaps on a more compact scale. Most of the mowing that I'm thinking about is in the driving alleys in between our fields. And I used to really think, I used to look at our mowed spaces on our farm and feel a sense of ease when they were well mowed and neatly mowed. And part of that was because if I had enough time to get on the mower and mow those areas, it meant that there wasn't a lot of other work that I was behind on. Um, so that felt good. And it also, I think I just like the look of mowed spaces. It just feels neat and tidy and feels somewhat soothing to me. So it has taken a shift in my perspective to be okay with some of these spaces being mowed less frequently. Um, and so, but it's also an interesting thing to think about because there are reasons to mow around fields. One, I think, is one reason we mow is to control rodent habitat, especially around the edges of buildings. Um, Thinking about encroachment of weeds into fields, things like quackgrass or other species that may, with a lot of photosynthetic potential, may grow rhizomes into our fields. And then controlling plants that will set seed, dandelion or some of the summer annual grasses like crabgrass or fall panicum are yeah, that can be a risk of unmowed spaces on the edges of our field. That said, I think I've been able to find a lot of opportunities where there may be something like the white clover blooming in this swale to the right, where I can let that grow without compromising any of these reasons to mow around fields. And so I've been trying to lean into letting that be into being okay with having some more unmowed spaces. So here's one. I would have felt uncomfortable with this unmowed space in between our fields here a few years ago, but it's become over time as I've tried to see the value of letting clovers flower in those spaces. It's become a little easier for me to have some of those unmowed spaces around our farm. Um, However, I think for us, especially, we do a lot of our fields will be out of tillage for 2 or 3 or more years. And a big threat to that production system is dandelions because they produce seeds like an annual and yet have a taproot like a perennial. So this picture was taken years ago, and this was a field in which I learned the hard way about not being aggressive enough in mowing dandelions around that field. So these years during dandelion season, back to this field of crimson clover and rye, I will try much harder to prevent dandelions from setting seed around that field, even though the dandelion itself is a really great pollen and nectar source for pollinators. I haven't been able to the effects on our production system are too great to maximize those flower blooms. And so I think that is everything I have.
Awesome. Thank you. So many great pictures from both of you. There is one question in the chat that asks, um, can you say what seeding rates are for your rye and crimson clover?
It would be an educated guess in the ballpark, but it's probably about 40 pounds per acre of rye and probably about 30 pounds per acre of crimson clover. And that's a pretty high crimson clover rate, I think, but so much more valuable to me, especially in terms of weed management, to have a full um, canopy coverage of the field beginning in the fall.
Great. And then a comment from Chuck about canola and mustard in the fall. If you don't mind the brassica overlap, I think that might have been in relation to, you were talking about mustards maybe in the spring. I'm not sure. But I guess I have a question related to the brassicas is you mentioned past maybe like experiencing pest pressure as a result of using that in your rotation. And I'm just wondering, with what you've been using so far with your cover crops, have you experienced any adverse pest pressure in your crops that you've noticed, or um, other kind of pitfalls or surprises from those?
I can go first, and then I'm curious, Chuck, to hear especially about the canola that you planted. But with mustard, I haven't grown mustard as a cover crop yet, and so I don't know if that would be an issue with flea beetles in the spring. I suspect it might, but I'm curious if anyone has had any experience with, if any, vegetable growers have had experience with the mustard cover crop and flea beetles. But no, with none of the other cover crops that we've grown, can I think of any pests that have been problematic from it.
Chuck, do you want to unmute for a minute and expand on what you were saying there?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So we have two kind of farm locations, and we try to rotate the brassicas from one to the other each year because of flea beetle pressure. And so this last fall was the first fall that we planted the mustard at one of the sites. And so we don't know what next spring is going to look like. I think it's a really interesting question. Flea beetles are definitely something that we have to be cognizant of, and we use a fair bit of row cover and things to deal with them. And so, yeah, I think that's a really great question. If other growers have experience with that, I think our general thought was if we could rotate, have the mustards and the brassicas, maybe they move opposite so that they're never at the same farm, or maybe they actually need to move together so that then there's nothing for a year of brassica family. So really good question. I'd never grown canola and mustard before. It was amazing from the pollination perspective, and so kind of really caught my eye. But then it did lead to this question of, are we setting the stage for a disaster? So we'll know
Can
more in the spring.
can you talk a little bit more about your canola cover crop, like when you seeded it and when you terminated it, and how you think it might fit into a rotation for you? And it sounds like you didn't see much flea beetle damage on it.
No, we saw really no flea beetle damage on it at all. We seeded it in early September, and so yeah. And as I said, we did it at the other site from where we had our fall brassicas, um, but saw no flea beetle action on it, and didn't terminate it until like late November. Actually, it was quite amazing that the flowers had clearly become no longer a pollen source for insects because we were past that window. But absolutely magnificent, and the flowers stayed, through frost and frost and frost, and not until I mowed it really, late. I had something you said, Ryan, I thought was very interesting. That idea, I'm in this habit of in November I kind of mow my swales, and like you, I really enjoy that kind of neat and tidy look as I go into the winter. but I really do wonder about the possibility of not mowing those until the spring. Um, I wouldn't want to get into the multi-year, not mowing because we get more woody material. But I'm interested. You really pointed that out, the idea of that overwintering habitat, which I hadn't really thought about, and so I'm also interested in that as an idea. Some of our swale areas are of course wet, so I'm trying to mow them when it's dry. So I can see getting into a little bit of a problem, and if we have a wet spring. But I love that idea of potentially leaving that and not managing it until the spring.
Yeah, and our swales are, they're just right in between our fields, and so I haven't, the it's shorter periods of time that I am leaving those unmowed. I'm leaving them unmowed for blooms, but I'm not leaving a lot of like coarser debris that could, be of much value as nesting sites in those swales, just because I don't know, I haven't imagined doing that yet. But
Mm-hmm.
I think more of the areas around our farm, like the hedgerows and the edges of the forest, is much more as the kind of the more valuable spaces for nesting sites. And I think it's interesting too. Like I spent some time in Wisconsin this summer and visited this pretty amazing piece of land on one of the branches of the Kickapoo River that had been farmed, plowed and corn and soy for some decades, up until the 1980s, early 1990s. This couple bought it and did a lot of prairie restoration in that area. And so it had these just amazingly diverse fields of flowering plants and grasses going up from the river. And every year they managed them by burning. And, they just, their strategy for maintaining insect populations in that space was burning a certain percentage of the land every year. So maybe one third of it they would burn and then burn another third the next year and the final third the year after that. And so it's just interesting to think that it's okay to not every space everywhere has to provide everything. That some spaces can be great nesting sites and that can maintain enough of a population to then go and utilize the flowers that are growing on other spaces.
I love that concept of rotational burning. I hear about rotational mowing and it kind of resonates a little bit with me in that regard. But I saw Jake, you had your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to unmute and comment about something. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, just a couple things. I grow a lot of mustard. Laura, you and I have been, I hope to talk soon about that. But one of the things that really is good about it is, well, a couple things. First of all, it has a fairly long flowering period. And unlike a lot of other crops, fast-growing crops like buckwheat, it does take quite a lot of frost. I've had we have a beekeeper who keeps 14 hives here, and I've seen bees in November and really on this mustard. I don't know. I don't grow brassicas anymore, but I recall from past experiences that that is a tricky issue. One of the problems with it is that if the adults flea beetles are really out in doing their thing in a cover crop like mustard, and you mow it, um, they don't die. They go find your broccoli. So that's always a problem. But I really like mustard. I think it's the only crop I know of that's really a smother crop. Buckwheat, there's always weeds underneath the buckwheat, somewhere underneath there. And buckwheat, I had a few years ago had a very bad experience with letting the buckwheat go to seed. And that's really tricky. It's also, somebody talked about sweet clover, no, vetch rather. Um, I thought a few years ago that I had found a wonderful cover crop and growing vetch, and letting it go to seed. And after it's mowed in the summer, it comes up in the fall with this incredible mat. It's like solid, And then the next spring, there were all kinds of little animals and toads, and it was very rich environment. But I've been living with those vetch seeds for 6 years now, and spinach is my main crop, and vetch and spinach don't get along. So any of these things, I think that's a real consideration about things going to seed, and whether that's something you want to have to live with. But um, there was one other thing. I was just talking to our beekeeper yesterday, and he reminded me that one of the most difficult times of year for pollinators as well as for predator insects and beneficial uh, insects is the middle of the summer, and he says his honey just drops off in the middle of summer. So I think that's a pretty crucial time. We don't think of that, and everybody gets busy and don't grow stuff, but that's an important time to take care of. Um, and the mustard is good that way. You can overlap it and get a pretty good crop. So I don't know. I'm looking forward to trying a lot of different things. I'm sort of semi-retired, so I joke with people and say what most vegetable growers would really like to do is grow cover crops. After 40 years, I'm a little tired of vegetables, so the cover crops is really fun, and I think I want to do a bunch of it, pass that on. Thanks.
Jake, can you talk a little bit about when you seed mustard and when you terminate it?
Uh, I terminated before, that's an easy question before it goes to seed. And it's tricky because the seeds form, sequentially up the stalk. So you got to kind of pay attention to that. But um, you can seed it first thing in the spring. I mean, as soon as you can get on the land, you can seed it. Um, it's Yeah, so I'm not, and I've been trying to keep track of what seeding will make it to the fall, and it's somewhere in late August. We'll make it into the fall because it does slow down a lot. Um, so that's basic, and it does not overwinter. Somebody I think implied that it overwinters, and it doesn't. And the only thing that I'm a little worried about, I was talking to this beekeeper, is it's the mustard I grow is Rojo mustard. It's very, very, very strong. It's used as a fumigant. And I am a little concerned that the honey is going to taste like mustard. So I don't know how that works. But anyhow, I don't know if that answers your question. I just keep seeding it though.
Yeah,
The
thanks.
seed is cheap. And even if it only grows up a few inches, it's better than nothing. And mowing it, I don't. You don't really have to mow it. I mean, over winter, it just sort of disintegrates. So and you certainly not mow it and till it. Just mow it and leave it. One other trick I learned that worked pretty good is planting rye if it gets to the point where it's too late in the fall to get a catch of vetch or clover, I found that I can seed with a drill, just a normal drill. I can seed peas into rye in the spring, and that works really slick. And that instead of waiting until you can get oats and peas on. So anyway,
Yeah, Jake, for about 5 years we had honeybees, and I had that very same impression as your beekeeper, which is that there's a real drop in honey production in the summer. And I was thinking about that. You're trying to make sure I could get some buckwheat in there, and of course, it's kind of the time of year when my ground is most spoken for. Um,
right, yeah,
and when some of the spring things come out, then I would try to get in there quickly. But your idea of maybe get some mustard in there, kind of as soon as possible, as soon as there's sort of empty ground in late June, early July, to try to get something on right then to help with that kind of fallow pollinator period in the summer.
Yeah,
Awesome.
you can't go wrong. It's the seed is so cheap that just to get a little place that's you've been there 4 or 5 days and nothing's happening. Just go out and throw some mustard on. If it comes up, it does. If it doesn't, you till it up or whatever. The other thing I just wanted to mention one more thing. It never occurred to me, but one of the tricks is to have pollinator plants available. We've been talking about this consistently, and it occurred to me a couple of years ago. We used to grow 11 acres of sweet corn, and we plant 4 varieties at least 6 times a year, and so it's always in tassel. And honeybees love pollen. It doesn't have any nectar, but they love the pollen on sweet corn. So that's an interesting thing. The downside is that most corn, field corn, and sweet corn, if it's not organic, is treated with neonicotinoids, and that's a drag. So anyway.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the discussion. We are just past 1, so I want to make sure we kind of start wrapping things up here. And just thank you so much to our presenters today for sharing their wisdom. And I just want to mention for next week, we have upcoming our Understanding Wholesale Distribution Options and Costs with Rose Wilson and Annie Harlow. So tune in to that next week. And thanks again to the Agency of Agriculture and the Transition to Organic Partnership Program for making these webinars possible. And yes, thanks to our growers and for all your questions as well and commentary. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thanks.